Hello again, and welcome to the Castle Old Skull HAWK Moor project, exploring the secret history of Dungeons & Dragons, Greyhawk, and Blackmoor as created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson. If you enjoy HAWK Moor and you want to keep me around on YouTube, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Today, we return to our explorations of buried secrets beneath the ice of the glacial rift of the frost giant Jarl. For as we read in The Heroes of Asgard by A&E Curie from 1906, henceforth Odin went on to the house of Loki's wife. The door was thrown open, and the wicked witch mother sat in the entrance, whilst on one side crouched Fenrir, her ferocious wolf son, and on the other stood Hel, most terrible of monsters and women. A crowd of giants strode after Odin, curious to obtain a glance of Loki's strange children before they should be sent away. At Fenrir and the witch mother they stared with great eyes, joyfully and savagely glittering. But when he looked at Hel, each giant became as pale as new snow and cold with terror as a mountain of ice. Pale, cold, frozen, they never moved again. But a rugged chain of rocks stood behind Odin, and he looked on, fearless and unchilled. Welcome to the realm of the frost giants. Let us now descend further. Welcome once again to HAWK Moor and our exploration of Gary Gygax's dungeon module G2, Glacial Rift of the Frost Giant Jarl. When we consider the Glacial Rift as it looms in the world of Greyhawk, we know that it is described as being far to the northwest of the steading of the hill giant chief. And in the published World of Greyhawk setting, it would later be explicitly set in Hex S5-134 in the Crystal Mist Mountains. This is a region of untamed wilderness, petrified crystalline ice, unrelenting fog, and the eerie stillness of a wasteland that only the native denizens can long survive. Unlike the steading of Nostra, the hill giant chief, however, the Glacial Rift is mostly a natural area of weird ice caves which have been modified by the frost giants, hacking at ice and stone to create a deeper fortress from the existing terrain. The ice is strangely translucent, and, at least during the day, it casts an eerie green glow throughout the caverns. Instead of doors, the frost giants plunk boulders down in narrow tunnel mouths to block the flow of wind and snow, and also adventurous intruders. It takes a few minutes of reading the G2 Dungeon Level 1 map to realize that it is not a subterranean environment at all. Rather, the Glacial Rift is an icy canyon surrounded by cave mouths, and the frost giants have sculpted tunnels to connect these interior areas to one another so that all eyes of the fortress gaze toward the center, where intruders must come through. Gygax would use this canyon and cave setting concept once again in 1980's dungeon module B2, Keep on the Borderlands, for the Caves of Chaos. One of the more notorious areas here adjacent to the Glacial Rift itself is known as the Misty Ice Cave. This is frozen, yet partially heated by air, which probably rises from the cook fires underground in the frost giantess's kitchens. This makes this cave dangerously wet and slick, and adventurers are likely to fall and drop precious items here. Dropped items, we read, have a 1 in 4 chance of falling into a crack in the floor and dropping somewhere into the bowels of the earth to be forever lost. In later years, Gary had a funny story about this room in particular. He recalled, "A couple of years back, I played Zigby, my main dwarf player character, in a play session my son Ernie was running using Module G2. It had been so long since I'd written the adventure and dungeon mastered it, damned if I hadn't totally forgotten the misty ice cave where everything is slippery. Poor Zigby slipped and lost his +2 magical shield down a crevasse. And so the master himself got his just desserts, foiled by his own son and his own trickery for once. But Gary seems to have thought this was pretty funny overall. Beyond the misty ice cave, there are also 2 encounter areas with winter wolves. Some of these creatures are tamed as guard hounds, while others are wild and are encouraged to roam the place by the frost giants. The winter wolves in Dungeons and Dragons were likely inspired in part by the Norse myth of Fenrir, the beast of slaughter, who shall arise once more at Ragnarok. A close reading of the monster manual shows that winter wolves are of average intelligence, and it stands to reason, like the similarly cunning ice toads and other monstrous horrors, that the wolves might well have their own language, which frost giants can understand. Here is a very interesting, relevant mythological passage from The Heroes of Asgard by A.N.E. Curie that I would like to share with you. Far away to the north of Asgard, surrounded by frowning mountains, the dark lake Amsvartnir lies, and above the level of its troubled waters burns Lyngvi, the island of sweet broom, flaming like a jewel on the dark brow of Helya. In this lonely isle, to which no ship but Skidbladnir could ever sail, the Aesir, with Fenrir in their midst, assembled to try the strength of the dwarves' magical chain. Fenrir prowled round his old master Tyr, with a look of savage triumph in his cruel eyes, now licking the hand that had so long fed him, and now shaking his great head and howling defiantly. The Aesir stood at the foot of Gial, the sounding rock, and they passed Gleipnir, the chain, from one to another, talking about it, while the wolf Fenrir listened. It was much stronger than it looked, they said, and Thor and Tyr vied with each other in their efforts to break it, while Bragi declared his belief that there was no one among Aesir or giants capable of performing so great a sundering feat, unless, he added, it should be you, Fenrir. This speech roused the pride of the ice wolf Fenrir, and after looking long at the slender chain and the faces of the Aesir, the wolf answered, Loath am I to be bound by this chain, but, lest you should doubt my courage, I will consent that you should bind me, provided one of you put his hand into my mouth, as a pledge that no deceit is intended. There was a moment's silence among the Aesir when they heard this. They looked at one another. Odin looked at Thor, and Thor looked at Bragi, and Frey fell behind and put his hand to his side, where his all-conquering sword, which he alone could wield, no longer rested. At length, Tyr stepped forward valiantly and put his strong right hand, with which he had so often fed the wolf Fenrir, into the cruel jaws. The frost giants are also assisted by ogres as mercenaries. In Gygax's descriptions, we learn that some other ogres are awaiting an audience with the Jarl, which may mean that they have come from the steading of the hill giant chief. Or it may also mean that a mountain ogre chieftain is thinking of forming an alliance with Jarl Grugnur. So for those dungeon masters who are hoping to create sequel or side adventure material for the giant modules, the lair of an ogre chieftain, perhaps a bit farther away, warmed by geyser caves, would surely be a reasonable setting to create for the world of Greyhawk in this region in the crystal mists. Deeper within the glacial rift, more curious still, are the ice toads. These enigmatic monsters are intelligent. They have their own croaking language, and they worship a piece of ancient precious stone, which almost looks like the idol of some unknown great old one, perhaps a primordial toad entity of some kind. I have recently found the origin of these classic monsters, the ice toads, in a rather unlikely source. It involves an old illustration by Arthur Rackham entitled Becuma of the White Skin, and this appears in the 1920 book Irish Fairy Tales. Of course, this is not the only source for monstrous toads in Dungeons & Dragons and Gary Gygax's conception, but it is the one that is most important to the ice toad subspecies. Looking deeper, one of the first glimpses of supernatural toads in Dungeons & Dragons, we will ignore the matter of Arneson's Temple of the Frog for now, can be found in Gygax's partial novel manuscript, The Gnome Cache. In the Dragon magazine, number 7, the most interesting part of Gary's tale comes right at the abrupt ending. Soon after the adventuring party has been discussing the icy marshland that we know as the Barony of Blackmoor, they encounter a dwarf being pursued by a pack of giant toads and weirdly hopping men. We learn much later that these are worshippers and minions of Wastri, the hopping prophet, who is briefly mentioned as leader of bullywugs of the vast swamp in Dragon magazine number 56. Wastri is finally revealed to us in Dragon number 71, and, uniquely among the Greyhawk deities, he can summon ice toads. This particular aspect of Greyhawk lore can be difficult to research further. Gary once provided a few more cryptic details in answer to a fan's questions. He explained as follows. Tim Kask didn't like the story of the Gnome Cache, so he dropped it from Dragon magazine. No biggie as far as I was concerned. The yarn was only my second attempt at writing a novel, and I myself wasn't all that happy with what I had produced. The story was loosely based on the world of Greyhawk, but the adventures were not drawn from any actual play of Dungeons & Dragons. The giant toads featured therein are the steeds of the followers of Wastri, the hopping prophet, certainly of Earth, and the pantheon of the Flanace. As for the conclusion, I cannot recall where I had the tale headed, and the manuscript for the story is missing, possibly buried among storied documents here, otherwise truly lost. Hopefully one day the Gnome Cache novel will rise from the depths for us to read. The ice toads in Dungeons & Dragons and the Glacial Rift seem Lovecraftian, and in addition to their origin in Becuma of the White Skin, they may be inspired in part by Tsathoggua and similar creatures. Also of interest here are the Miri Nigri minions, which are mentioned in The Horror from the Hills, a story by Frank Belknap Long. In that tale, we learn this. Chogner Fawn did not always dwell in the east. Many thousands of years ago, he abode with his brothers in a cave in Western Europe, and made from the flesh of toads a race of small dark shapes to serve him. And it goes on. The Miri Nigri were fashioned from the flesh of primitive amphibians. And we also learn that these creatures are humanoid. So these are probably not ice toads proper, but in Gary's conception, rather one of the inspirations for bullywugs and similar creatures instead. The great old one, Tsathoggua, was mostly closely linked with toads by the gifted writer of fantasy Clark Ashton Smith. Smith, of note to our frost giant discussion here, also placed his mythic lands in Hyperborea, near the frigid boreal sea. A little sleuthing to the article entitled Conan vs. Tsathoggua, as written by Rick Lai, also uncovers the fact that Tsathoggua was a favorite of Robert E. Howard as well. Consider this from his tale, The Black Stone. A huge, monstrous, toad-like thing squatted on the top of the monolith. I saw its bloated, repulsive, and unstable outline against the moonlight, and set in what would have been the face of a natural creature, its huge, blinking eyes, which reflected all the lust, abysmal greed, obscene cruelty, and monstrous evil that has stalked the sons of men since their ancestors moved blind and hairless in the treetops. In those grisly eyes were mirrored all the unholy things and vile secrets that sleep in the cities beneath the sea, and that skulk from the light of day in the blackness of primordial caverns. And so that ghastly thing that the unhallowed ritual of cruelty and sadism and blood had evoked from the silence of the hills leered and blinked down on its bestial worshippers who groveled in abhorrent abasement before it. Now the beast-masked priest lifted the bound and weakly writhing girl in his brutish hands and held her up toward that horror toad on the monolith. And as that monstrosity sucked in its breath, lustfully and slobberingly, something snapped in my brain, and I fell into a merciful faint. Also of interest is another Conan tale, The Slithering Shadow, also entitled Zuthal of the Dusk. This story features the unholy entity Thog the Ancient, the god of Zuthal, who is likely a spawn of Tsathoggua himself, hence the similar name. There we read as follows. In that hurricane of battle, they were rolling over and over, farther and farther down the tunnel. Conan's brain reeled with the punishment he was taking. His breath came in whistling gasps between his teeth. High above him he saw a great toad-like face, dimly limned in an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from it. And with a panting cry that was half curse, half gasp of straining agony, he lunged toward it, thrusting with all his waning power. Hilt deep his saber sank, somewhere below the grisly face, and a convulsive shudder heaved the vast bulk that half enveloped the Cimmerian. With a volcanic burst of contraction and expansion, it tumbled backward, rolling now with frantic haste down the corridor. Conan went with it, bruised, battered, but invincible, hanging on like a bulldog to the hilt of his saber, which he could not withdraw, tearing and ripping at the shuddering bulk with the poignard in his left hand, goring the thing to ribbons. The thing glowed all over now with a weird phosphorus radiance, and this glow was in Conan's eyes, blinding him, as suddenly the heaving, billowing mass fell away from beneath him, the saber tearing loose and remaining in his locked hand. Considering all these weird tales that Gary was reading, suddenly the naturally shaped, precious idol which the glacial rift ice toads worship as a god upon its altar seems a lot more unsettling and interesting than the mere obscure riddle text in Dungeon Module G2 would imply. It gives us quite a lot to think about. In our next exploration of the glacial rift, we will look in detail at some of the other intriguing monsters beneath the rift itself, including such creatures as the Yeti, the brown mold, the frost giants, the white dragons, and more. Thank you for watching and listening to HAWK Moor. I will see you next time. Stay tuned.